Okay, so we're gonna, in this fifth lecture, we're going to discuss the rule of law and sort of finish that up. All right, so keep in mind that legislation is a matter of will, right? People decide what to do and they go ahead and they do it. And the legislative process produces law, right? Simply by just the virtue that a bunch of people in an assembly of some sort decide that a given law is to be produced. No one says the law is good. No one says the law serves its purpose. No one says that the people will follow the law. Nothing says that that law they create is constitutional. A bunch of people in the legislature decide we need a law about this. And the history of that lawmaking is fraught with all kinds of manipulations for additional power. Keep in mind that the rule of law is supposed to keep that in check, right? Equality, everyone treated the same. But you can create circumstances whereby the government is given more power, and that power allows the legislative body to create laws that go well beyond what they've been, the power they've been given. So basically, these are powerful politicians, and the rule of law is supposed to be something that, as I say, keeps them in check, or is an alternative, right, to how things should be. When you look at the scholars that have looked at the rule of law, people being governed by measures laid down in advance in general terms and enforced equally, and that's the big word here, right, according to the terms in which they have been publicly promulgated. Remember, public has to be aware of them. The argument that it should be put aside because it does not contrast sufficiently with the rule of men seems perverse. In other words, we should move the rule of law aside because it doesn't, when looked at the rule of men, when it looks at the rules they make, it seems to maybe be in conflict. There are criticisms of the rule of law, which we're not going to really go into, but Aristotle and others, and mostly those have to do with whether or not the rule of law really constrains, the rule of law really constrains those that make the rules, and it's still subject to manipulation and also agreement about what is an acceptable rule and what's not. So you get these theorists of the rule of law, and they give laundry lists usually of the principles of compromise. In other words, here's all the things, we're going to go over some of those, that we expect the rule of law to be comprised of. Now, these are not consistent, and they divide these principles that address these formal aspects of governance by law, principles that are supposed to address procedural aspects, and principles that embrace certain substantive values. So it's procedural, which is things like letting people know, and so on and so forth, and substantive values. What are they trying to produce here? What is the goal of this thing? Where are we supposed to end up if, in fact, we adhere to this? So probably the best known formulation of these principles is probably Lon Fuller's quote-unquote inner morality law. This goes back to 1964. And he talks about these elements: generality, publicity, prospectivity, intelligibility, consistency, practicability, stability, and congruence. So these principles are formal because they concern the form of the norms that are applied to our conduct, right? Practicability, stability, these are the norms that we expect. So the formal requirement that there be generality does not guarantee justice, right? And that's ultimately what we really want to get to, right? That's the whole point. But that partly reflects the fact that justice and the rule of law work as separate criteria, right, for evaluating a political system. What we mean by that, in part, is that justice itself is what we're trying to, get to. And generality, as an example, doesn't necessarily, work in accordance with that. That there's separate criteria for evaluating what goes on in a political system and what's consistent with the rule of law. So, nevertheless, the generality is important feature of the legality of something. It's reflected in long-standing constitutional antipathy of the bills of attainder, right, where you can just keep punishing people that have been found in sort of running afoul of the law and their family and so on. So you need particular structures, particular order. So all these things like generality and the like is basically comes down to they have to be, the laws that they come up with have to be stable general rules about the particulars, the goal, where we're going with this thing, will people know about all that stuff. So the rule of law envisions what operating as a relatively stable, because you can't have the rule of law moving about. You know, it's a rule, and rules are not meant to be made up and then broken, and new rules and broken, and so on and so forth, because that's not stable. And people need to know what is their responsibility as citizens, of a government, and how do they meet those responsibilities, and when they run afoul of them. You can't expect people, again, I've said several times, to adhere to a rule they know nothing about. So it requires public knowledge. The public needs not only to know it, but understand it. It has to be intelligible. They have to be able to get their minds around it. Or there are intermediary institutions, like the media and others, which is not done its job as of late. One of the downsides of more and more media outlets is they're fighting for basically the same market share. And so they become more or less entrenched in a particular ideology so they can secure that piece of the market, rather than being the intermediary institutions between what the people want and the government's ability to sort of meet those needs. So that's sort of broken down. That's not a good sign, because that's part of making the laws intelligible, making the laws so people can be aware of them, there's public knowledge of it, that there's generality to it, and that it doesn't change all the time. Rules that change are not rules. And I'm not talking about exceptions to rules. There are always exceptions to rules. I give the example, and it's a rather small and insignificant example, but nevertheless it's an example. And that example is, there may not be any candy before dinner. That's the rule that mom and dad have laid down. One day, one of the children gets a candy bar, the other one doesn't, and says, hey, we're not supposed to have any treats before dinner. Why is he getting a treat? And they could say, well, this is an exception because of a very rough day, something happened, he got hurt, whatever it may be, whatever they rationalize. So there's an exception. There always has to be exceptions to rules. If there's no exception to a rule, if the rule is not somewhat flexible, but not too flexible, it can't accomplish its goal, because you can't predict every possible scenario under which that rule is going to have to be applied. So you have to know that you can change or reinterpret that rule a little bit. You do too much of that, the essence of the rule is lost, and then no one knows what it means. And that creates a lot of instability. Unfortunately, a lot of instability is brought to the political system by the desires for power of the elites and for the media. And the goal here is really simple. Let's get power by whatever means. That's corruptive. And it runs contrary to the idea of a republic and a democracy. And it should be not permitted, right? We should be able to know that that's what's going on and then do something about ending it, if you will. All right. So people are going to be held responsible for complying with the rules, but there again, they need certain structures in place with that rule so they can do so. So think about it this way. Laws really face in two directions, right? The first is they impose requirements for ordinary citizens to comply with. And second, they issue instructions to officials about what to do in the event of noncompliance by citizens. You write the law, you make the citizens know, they know what their responsibility is, and now the legislators have to say, okay, what happens if there's noncompliance? What do we do? What do we do with that? I would argue for example, tax-wise, the most treacherous sort of part of the landscape is not from the poor or the really wealthy. The poor have nothing to tax, and you're not concerned with them. The wealthy have the means to fight the taxes and do things that are perfectly acceptable, right? Tax avoidance, so they can keep their money. But that middle of the road, people that are making, $200,000, $250,000, $300,000, $500,000, even up to $1 million, you can really go after them because it's worth the investment of the government applying the rules to that group because they have enough money where it's worth looking into and taking some, but not so much that they can fight you and the cost goes way up, so it's not worth it. To collect $500,000 in a tax debt, let's say, but it's going to take you in terms of human hours and everything else, it's going to cost you $1.5 million, you're not going to do it. Right? You're not going to do it. But if it's going to cost $300,000, it's worth going after that person. So there's two things about that I want you to keep in mind to demonstrate the manipulation that can occur. There are practical matters. You can enforce certain laws, and you can't enforce others on entire sectors. So, for example, when the IRS was charged with getting more money, making sure there's more compliance with the tax law, what they did was they went after people that made $200,000 or a bit more. But they didn't get enough money in, and so they were criticized and said, why didn't you go after people making $500,000 a year or more? Why did you go after this group? Well, that group is easy pickings. So it's weird. It's like on one side of the river is poverty and middle class stuff and all of that in varying degrees. And then there's this river of reality and power that if you can jump over, I mean, you make a lot of money, right? The rules are different on the other side. The other bank, the river, the rules are different. Many people try and make that jump and right into the rapids and are swept away. So I mean that's the goal here, right? In terms of structural things. So even though it's important that the rule is clear, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be applied to everybody. So really, in the first instance, right, its concern about the people knowing is just to be effective, right? So the law requires public, publicity and explanation so that people can get their minds around it. Clarity is also important. But here again, legislation is written, and one way to sort of bury people is to have that legislation be so voluminous that it's almost impossible to get through, right? I mean, the Constitution of the United States, very short document, very powerful, ideas and concepts. When you get a 1,000-page bill, like a healthcare bill under Obama, it's 1,000 pages. Who can read it? Who can look at every nuance? So really, the more you write, the more freedom it gives to individual politicians, those seeking power, to interpret it the way they would like. And there's very little, oversight, right? Because cases have to work their way up to the court, and if the court's not respected and you don't adhere to what the court says, it's all pointless, right? So what comes out of it is that the law can't be equally applied, and you can easily distort the law and confuse people, and I mean experts. I think, my recollection may be off, but I believe that when the healthcare bill, Obamacare, was put in place, basically the legislature was told, don't read it. It was time to read it afterwards. We have to vote on it. We have to pass it. That's anathema to the idea of legislative deliberation to come up with the most important means of accomplishing a goal. Take your time, get it done right, and then explain it to people. How do you explain a 1,000-page document? Not really possible. How do you make that intelligible for the average person? How does that become clear? How can you, assess whether it's fair or it's not fair? How do you do that with 1,000 pages? I don't know. You can't do it. And also, judges have to be able to look at that later on. What's interesting, for example, regulatory law, with regulators, the court gives a lot more sway to regulators than it does to others coming before the court, because regulators regulate a specific area where they're supposed to be experts, right? So if they're doing that, the court says, okay, well, explain it to us. There's been criticism of the court because they've said, well, the court should have more people on it so you get experts in that area and experts in this area and so on and so forth. Now, that may make sense, but it also is problematic. How many different, justices have to be put in place to meet all the structural requirements of different areas of business of life, right? It's not practical. So the question is, what do you do with that if you don't have that sort of structure in place? Well, it comes before the court, and the court has to assess it based on its constitutionality. And then if there's a need to understand it, that's why the court can have people come and basically give them their half hour or whatever and have them explain it. And their job on the other side, right, when they have the opportunity to do that, is to make that clear to the court, what they mean by it and so on and so forth. So, the list of, formal characteristics and procedural principles, while it's problematic, we have to say, it helps us understand what the rule must accomplish and how those in power must assess and create that rule with an eye towards those elements, comprehensibility, all of that, practicality. They need to be able to demonstrate that. And so if you look at what others have said about the rule and what it must do, this is Tashima. You don't have to remember the name, but first, a hearing by an impartial and independent tribunal. And tribunal could be anything here. We could say it's the court. We could say it's a Senate or a House, where people are testifying in a certain case, right? So the tribunal that is required then to administer existing legal norms, the things we've come to accept as true, on the basis of what? A formal presentation of the evidence in an argument. That's a court. That's what you do. You come with your argument, court hears both sides, right? Or you go to Congress and a committee has people testify that are supposed to be experts, and we're not going to go into issue networks, and the revolving door. I touched on it briefly at, a few lectures ago, but that's very corruptive of that process where Congress calls people in to sort of testify before their committee on a particular thing. The general principle there is they get people in that they know what they're going to say and they support their side. And then to make it seem fair, they call in the average, Joe and Jane to come in and tell us how they feel. And then they all thank them for coming in. And this has been very informative. Thank you so much. And then they dismiss it because that doesn't serve, their goal, what they're hoping to do. The second thing is a right to representation by counsel at such a hearing. Now, we have that in the Constitution, right? You must have counsel. But here again, no one says they have to be good. No one says they have to be exacting. No one says they have to come up with the right arguments, right? If you have a lot of money, you can pay a lot of lawyers and they can work through those things. If you don't, you're sort of stuck, right? A right to be present to confront and question witnesses and to make legal arguments about the bearing of evidence, and the various legal norms relevant to the case. They've got to have that. A right to hear reasons from the tribunal when it reaches its decision, a written decision, right, which are responsive to the evidence and arguments presented before it. All right, so that's the process. You come before the Supreme Court, which is what we're most interested in. Each side makes their oral arguments. The court then asks questions, and the evidence is looked at and all of that. And then the tribunal makes a decision, but writes up that decision, why they got there, and so on. Now, why is that important? It informs and instructs the public and those that enforce the laws how the court will interpret particular actions and evidence under a given situation. So everyone's aware that, if this happens and they can prove that, then the court's probably going to decide this way. You need that. Otherwise, you can't really predict what the court's going to do, and you don't know what the rules are. You don't know what the rules are. You don't know how to interpret them. You end up screwing things up. Very political science term there, screwing things up. All right. So, there's manipulations, like when you look at Guantanamo Bay, right? They're called, they're not called prisoners, right? Enemy combatants. There's no real, it's been used before George W. Bush, and it was just as vague then as it was under Bush. It's a black hole. We don't really, legally it's a black hole. We really don't know if it's an enemy combatant what the court's responsibility is or authority is or that sort of thing in dealing with it. If you look, these detainees, not prisoners, they were detainees, but they had no right to access to the courts and so on. And Guantanamo Bay is in Cuba. It's not in the continental United States or in Hawaii or Alaska. It's in another nation's, control, right? But really what it is we have a permanent, in Guantanamo, we rent that or we lease it permanently, and the Cubans can't kick us out. So for all intents and purposes, it's U.S. soil, but not technically. This is what I was talking about before, right? There's a manipulation that can happen very easily, and that's problematic. All, by the way, in the name of the rule of law. So the opportunity there to appear before a legal tribunal is questionable. Now think of something that happened recently. The quote-unquote insurrection, right, the Capitol. Insurrection is a particular thing. The question is, if someone's accused of insurrection, do they get the same, treatment, right? Or is, in terms of the legal process, or should they not get the same treatment? Can we lock them up without giving their day in court for weeks or months or what have you? They never see the evidence against them. They're just the sort of being able to say that, well, they're insurrectionists, giving them that label, that nomenclature, causes certain things to fall by the wayside in terms of the rule of law, or at least become in that gray area about what we're required to do, and so on and so forth. So we see that stuff happening. And it's not a specific thing. It's not, in the United States, it's not a Republican thing. It's not a Democratic thing. They basically, over time, have all used mechanisms to affect certain ends, no matter how serious you may think the event is or not. That's what they do. All right. So the rule of law is important because in the procedural or process of initiating it and executing it, there's specific things that should happen. Those specific things are designed to protect, and make the rule of law an effective means of getting to justice. So keep in mind that the formal procedural stuff generate a certain momentum in a substantive direction. In other words, the procedures are supposed to meet the substance of the law. What the goal is, what the purpose is. If it doesn't do that, and I've repeated this through almost every lecture, then there's no point to it. It's just really a show. So this idea of stability and publicity and clarity, all of that's about making it consistent and giving everybody a sense of what they need to do to accomplish a particular end. If they don't have that, they don't know what they're doing. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of people that have, philosophers and political scientists and so on and so forth, historians, even sociologists that have looked at all of this. So once you open up the rule of law having a substantive dimension, substance, right, teeth, we sort of inaugurate a sort of competition in which everyone clamors to have their favorite political ideal incorporated as a substantive dimension of the rule of law. In other words, this is something that should be part of the rule of law because its character has the substance necessary to meet the purpose of what the rule demands. Now, for example, those who favor property rights and a market economy, they scramble to get to a privilege in terms of the rule that really affects their values in this regard. Okay, that sounds very twisted, but the truth is this. When you hear people say, I don't know people who complain about taxes, the rich pay by far more taxes than the poor or middle class. And everyone goes, yeah, so we should really leave the rich alone. The people that make several $1,000,000 a year and more. Well, here's why that's misleading. And that's the rule. That's what they want. They want people to believe that that's the structure. But it's a relative thing. If I'm worth $45 billion and I pay $10 million in taxes, that's a relatively small percentage of my worth and what money I've made. And so I'm well beyond what's necessary to meet my needs. I'm into the area where these are all wants now. Yes, the middle class person, the poor person pays less in taxes in the aggregate, but what they need to survive represents a bigger percentage of their income. Okay, so you make $50,000 a year and you end up paying $15,000 of that in, say, income tax. I mean, don't quote me on the tax tables here, but you get the point. That $15,000 really means something to that person making 50. Now they're down to $35,000. And that's what they're living on. Someone that makes all their money, they may pay a lot more than that, but that money represents a small percentage of their total income. And so they've more than just covered their basic needs. So there's ways of massaging this thing so you can manipulate it. And I don't think I've ever heard, and I'm sure someone has, but I can't recall anyone ever saying, wait a minute, this is really a percentage of income thing. Except for, there was one instance, I'm trying to remember now who it was, one of the billionaires. Anyway, he talked about his secretary having to pay more taxes than him. It's a relative thing. And so although, there are people that don't have to pay any income tax because they don't make enough, they don't make enough. The minimum wage in the country is pegged to the poverty line. Now think about that. The minimum wage is not designed to get you above poverty, but keep you at poverty. So no one falls below that poverty line, right? If you've got a job making minimum wage. The problem with minimum wage is that there's a federal minimum wage and states can't go below that. So they have to add a little something on top of that. But people think, well, if you're making $20 an hour, that's pretty good. But extrapolate. $20 an hour, 40-hour week, let's say, is $800 a week, right? $800 a week. That's $3,200 a month. That's like $35,000, $36,000 a year. And that's making $20 an hour. So how much do you have to make? And then if they're going to take any taxes from that or not, doesn't matter. If they leave you $32,000 alone, you're hovering sort of at that point where you're never going to be able to do certain things. But you can probably put a roof over your head, food on the table, that sort of thing. Now, when you consider that the senators and the like, the President of the United States makes $400,000 plus, which is really amazingly sort of shocking because, the President's basically sort of the CEO of the country and is not making a whole lot of money, but there's a lot of perks. And after they're done with their term, they make a ton of money from their memoirs and everything else. So what would it take? Well, $40 an hour brings you at $64,000, right? I'm just extrapolating. Hopefully the math is correct. But you get it. $64,000. Might sound like a good salary. $40 an hour, but who's making $40 an hour? What about $100 an hour? $100 an hour means you make how much in a 40-hour week? You make $4,000, right? So if you're making $100 an hour, your income over the course of a year is going to be like $250,000. That's at $100 an hour. Now imagine your average lawyer in a major firm making $1 million a year. They're charging $300, $400, $500 an hour. And then there's the argument, is anyone really worth $500 an hour? The person making minimum wage, is this guy making $500,000 a year? Is he or she really adding that much added value that they should be making, over the $20 an hour person, they're making 500. That's 25 times, there's a lot of math here, 25 times the amount, right? And are they really producing 25 times the value? Someone could do all that math. The idea is straight. The math may be a little off. All right. So the rule of law, having this substantive dimension, is important. But then people try and say, well, this is valuable and it is substantive to the rule of law, so we need to do this. So, for example, all these tech outlets, Facebook and all of them, they got the government to agree that they can't be sued because their original argument was, look, we're doing this. We're giving the public a forum. We can't be responsible for what people do on that forum. If they get up there and say things or do things that are unacceptable, here it goes, right? We can't police all of that, so we can't be held responsible. So the Congress said, you know what? You guys aren't responsible. But that opened the door for them to manipulate it to where they could limit what people posted or said, and they could screen it through their own particular perspective. So now it was an anathema to and ran contrary to freedom of speech. And the very thing they want to be protected from, no longer do they need to be protected from, because they can themselves decide what can get through and what can't get through, right? So there you have a manipulation of the rule. And it sounds good at the beginning, but then it turns into just the opposite. They can control what people put up, and they can pull people offline. And so why should they be protected now? They've distorted the process. So why aren't we doing anything about that? Because they're very powerful, and because they've reached that point where they can act in concert. And, you don't get senators that need money and representatives that need money to run for office. You don't really get them so willing to, fight these big, monopolies, really, or oligopolies. There's few of them. But think about that. You want our money, and you want us not to cut you off from the public and distorting the truth about you so you don't get elected. So are you really going to hold these people's feet to the fire? I mean, it runs contrary to you wanting power. So, the fix is in. I think one of the worst decisions made by the Supreme Court was in Citizens United. And I may have touched on this before, but the court said money is free speech. So if you have money, you want to spend it, you should be allowed to spend it. Money corrupts the whole process, because if you need money to run, in the House of Representatives, for example, they spend one of their 2 years in office, have to run every 2 years, trying to get more money so they can run again, so they can keep their jobs, they can make their salary. And that's perfectly human. Going back to that first lecture, right? People behave in very predictable ways, which you think would make governance a whole lot easier, right? But people are not aware of it. And the two parties don't do very much to disabuse people of it. The two parties are complicit in it, because if you need a lot of money to run, you can keep people from challenging you that don't have a lot of money. And you keep those coffers getting full, right, your war chest, by really doing the bidding of those who will contribute to you. And politicians will change policy. They'll change regulations to meet the needs of those people that are basically giving them money to run. Now, today there's a lot of talk about China and how China is taking over, like African countries and South America, basically through capitalist means. They've captured capitalists by using their own structure, because human nature is greedy. And so they just said, hey, you want some more money? Do this. And we've gone ahead and done it. We don't like what your newspaper said about us. Take it out and retract it, or we're not going to advertise in your newspaper anymore. And so they said, well, we can't have that. And little by little, they take over. And why they would want to do that, is really just human nature, right? It's very corruptible. Very corruptible. So these values that underline the rule of law can be manipulated. These substantive values get structured and created to serve not the general public. And oftentimes they're too complicated. I mean, you ask the average person on the street, and this is going to sound crazy, you could ask some of them who the President of the United States is, and they won't know. And you figure that's not right. You would say that's not true. I know it's not true. You're just manipulating us and telling us that. You ask enough people, forget about the vice president, forget about who is the Speaker of the House. They don't even know what the Speaker of the House is. So you get a very dumbed down public that doesn't understand the structure, let it go the substance, easily confused and manipulated, and you get a situation where an outside power like China can really manipulate things. And pretty soon you're not as free as you think you are, because the rule itself then gets distorted. I still say the best book ever on human nature and on politics is Animal Farm by Orwell. Animal Farm. It lays out exactly what human behavior is and how it's corruptible and what it leads to. And this is the game over and over again. And the thing is, you can't legislate into the hearts and minds of people what is not there by nature and nurture. You can't impose a moral perspective on those who are immoral. No one walks around saying, oh, I'm immoral as hell. Everyone justifies themselves by saying, well, their behavior is either moral or, hey, everybody does it. And therefore it's okay. I remember basketball. LeBron James, basketball is very big in China. And I think I talked about this before, but not in this way. Selling shoes there and so on really creates a lot of wealth. And they talked about this on one of these sports shows. And they said, well, should he be doing that? That's not right. And then one of the, talking heads got very sort of upset about it and said, wait a minute, this is done by everybody. Why shouldn't he be allowed to go after and create increased wealth? And no one knew what to say to that. And the argument is everyone else is doing it. That's the point. It's a den of thieves, if you will. And therefore, why shouldn't LeBron or anyone else do it? Well, we can't blame him. He's creating more wealth for himself. And that's understandable that people would feel that way. But it becomes a sort of rush to the bottom. Everybody's trying to get for themselves, and eventually they eat out the sustenance of everyone, including themselves, because ultimately, if you take enough from the people, there's more people than there are elites. Those people will rise up, right? And you can't kill them all. And if you did, you totally eviscerate the entire society. So what makes people rise up? Well, one thing that's important is economics. As we talk about LeBron and others making as much money as they can, and I don't want to pick on him because there's tons of people doing it, but it's just a good example because I think most people know who he is. As we think about this and we look at the money coming in, we have to say, okay, well, what makes people say enough is enough? Their economics. I'm going to the pump and I'm paying $5 a gallon for my gas, and I need, there's no numbers that say the number of hours and the distances being driven has gone down. Not significantly at all. The price has gone up of fuel, but people mostly have to use fuel to get to work or what have you. Electric cars, they recharge them and they pay to recharge it. But electricity is created. 95% of it, 90% of it is created by fossil fuels. So you're using electricity that's created by fossil fuels to, and then these batteries, we're not even sure, you get different sort of takes on it, but the batteries are uncertain. Not only their effectiveness, but what you do with them when they're no longer usable, how you dispose of them, that sort of thing. It's just like the manipulation around recycling. Should we recycle or not? Well, recycling is a good thing to a point. If you look at recycling plastics, and you'll have to check me on this, but I think there are 6 different types of plastics, and only the first 2 are recyclable. The other ones, and they're numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think it's 3, 4, 5, 6 are not recyclable. You can't use them again. They serve no purpose. But yet, if you look at the history of plastics in this country, that's the way that industry moved. Look, Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Next time you go into a pizzeria, and I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule, but if you go into a pizzeria, you'll notice that 80% of the time it's only Pepsi or Coke, but never both. Now those two companies have taken over basically the soft drink industry, and they sort of divide up the market. For the most part, they divide it up. You go to a diner and you say, "Yeah, I'll can I have a Coke." They say, "Oh, Pepsi, okay." If you go to a supermarket next time, you look at soft drinks that are on sale. You'll notice that some weeks it's Pepsi and some weeks it's Coca-Cola, or the products that those companies make. They've locked down the market. Now, do we all fret over that at night? That one's better than the other? No, but it's still monopolized the market, and they increase their value by obviously putting their stuff out there. And if you can prevent certain places from selling your product or cut a deal so they sell only one product at a time. You see the same thing, by the way, with liquor, wines and stuff. There are certain places where certain companies will not sell their wine. That's not an area that they go into, not because of economics. They've divvied it up. Why would you say you can't sell that bottle of red wine, Pinot Noir, whatever, but not that one? It's not just shelf space, right? It's that, the distributor won't distribute that here. Now, why? Because that forces people to buy other product, right? And although you go into a liquor store, it seems to be a vast amount. But there again, there are things you're not going to find there. How many times have you done that, or know someone that's gone and said, "Yeah, they didn't have any of that. I went to go look for this, they didn't have it." Okay, so look, there's no way of getting away from all of this. The legal constraints and the circumstances of modern life, they're going to force certain things to happen, but it's how they happen and what we do when they happen, right? How we respond to that. Some things we let go, other things we don't. It used to be when you saw something that said made in China, you would think, "Oh, it's cheap." Now try and find something that's not made in China. Or if it's made in some other country, who is in control of that country? And you realize all this wealth is going to China. And they want to be dominant. Now, look, all great powers have always come to their demise by the very means that they got there. The Holy Roman Empire expanded so far, and all it wanted was its taxes, but they couldn't control it any longer. It got too big to control. The United States, our undoing, is capitalism, the very thing that brought us to such wealth, right? World War II helped, World War I helped, in terms of Europe being leveled, basically. But nevertheless, capitalism is now being used to take power away from us, the United States, and moving it to China. They beat us at our own game, sort of thing, right? And so, what do we do now? How do we control that? Do we need to control it, right? And that's China's a whole nother story, and the history of that is fraught with all kinds of corruption, manipulation, because people want money, and China can buy you. And once they've bought you, whether you're a corporation or an individual or a sports figure or a nation, once they've made that inroad, they have access to your resources, they have access to your markets, and they have control over your people. Now, the rule of law, with its clarity and all those requirements, really is based society by society, government by government, what those rules look like, and so on and so forth. And we've talked about that. But when you get an outside force that then imposes its rule of law, its structure, like re-education camps, because you don't agree with them, or like in the Ukraine where opposition is being locked up, once you accept that that's the reality, then you're stuck with it. There was a, I believe he was a sociologist, I'm going to say that, Lou Buscaglia, many, many years ago. They used to call him the love doctor. Maybe he was a psychiatrist. Anyway, and And he was very famous, and he talked about, human nature and so on and so forth. But one thing he said is that we all, countries, individuals, have all the paint brushes and colors that we need, and we all have a blank canvas. And we can paint whatever picture we want, but once we're done painting, in you go. And what he meant by that is you make a decision by your own actions about what you're going to create, whether it's a government, whether it's a personal life. But once you've created it, you suffer the consequences and also get the advantages of having created it, right? Look, all this talk nowadays about Russia, and you have to ask yourself, okay, does Russia have the ability to control the markets and control countries? And the answer is no. I've heard it bandied about, and I've not checked it out, and I've heard it from a few different sources, but that Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's. So how are they taking over the world? Well, we're turning a blind eye to China, right? And their structure, their rules of law. You have to assume that once they expand, they control more, especially if they can get the world to go off the U.S. currency and go on theirs. Now they control everything. And it might take, usually great powers last because they have resources, right? It was whale oil with the Netherlands. And then all of a sudden some other form of energy comes along that's more efficient, and, they go by the wayside because they didn't change or what have you. It sort of takes 50 to 100 years, usually 100 years, maybe a little bit longer, for countries to sort of hit that place where they have to get past it, or they could just, could be their demise. We've made it longer than that in the United States, but the question is, we're painting a picture, and is the picture we're painting today, or one we painted yesterday, or under what regime, or under what presidency, or what political party? Where have we faltered? And if we have faltered, what do we do about it? Because believe it or not, the rule of law here based on constitutional principles, the one we've all become accustomed to, even though we debate or argue over certain things, even though people manipulate the reality on all sides, that's the world we've created. And we have arguments to, about the rule of law, to move that through evidence in the courts, and that's why the courts have to not be politicized, to come to a determination about whether somebody conforms to that rule or doesn't conform to that rule, and the substantive value of the rule, okay, what it protects. So basically, it's really critically important that once a society is together, a government, a nation, and you get this in place, there are expectations about how things could happen. And then if there's expectations, do we conform to those expectations, the government? So I will leave you with this. And I believe that maybe you've seen this. I haven't seen it, but I've heard of it. And if it's true, it's really disturbing. Commercial running in New York City about what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. Now think about that. During the Cold War with the then Soviet Union, there was MAD, right? Mutually assured destruction. Nobody would open up a silo because all these missiles would start flying back and forth, and the elites and everybody else would be, obviously, either would die from it or would certainly lose their wealth, whatever it is. And so nobody wanted it. But here we have advertisement in New York. I'm looking for this. I want to find it because if it's true, this person calmly telling you, well, what do you do in the case of a nuclear attack? The last time they did this sort of thing was back in the 1950s when, after World War II, there was concern there would be an exchange of nuclear weaponry and bombing each other. But there they would tell school children, just get under your desk. You're not going to survive under your desk. You're not going to survive inside your apartment. The likelihood is very, very small, especially with a direct hit. But why are they telling New Yorkers this? It strikes fear into people. Oh, this could happen. And that means they have more control over you. When you feel that you are under threat, and when you feel that the fear is running high, we tend to give more power to our elites and to our rulers because we still believe they're going to do the right thing. in a place like China, they can keep that fear generated, fear of the government. And so you just go inside, right? What happens when a country complies with that? What happens when the fear is ratcheted up? What happens to the rule of law? People are okay with it being vacated or manipulated because it's in our own best interest. Who says? All right, there's a lot about the relationship between the rule of law and substantive structures and procedures that lead to some goals and what that rule of law should be based on. In the United States, it's based on things that are somewhat different, in some ways very different than, say, China, right, or India, or some other place. They had a different path to the present, and they have different ambitions. Power, that's why the race to have nuclear weaponry. It was, well, we can all go down together. If you attack us, we're all going down. And so it makes sense that human nature would kick in here, but human nature is predictable. So systems and structures have to be put in place to keep that in check. Now, who could use power against the structure? People that have power already as they try and expand it. So how do we go about policing that? Well, the people that are going to police it, they become corrupt. I mean, if you look at the regulatory bodies, and I'd have to check how many are doing this, but Congress sets up regulatory bodies, and they say, why should our government be paying to regulate that industry? That industry is going to pay to be regulated. How insane is that? You're paying my salary to regulate you. How is that going to go? You think I'm going to really come after you? Or you think maybe I'm going to help you sort of do things on the margin or help sponsor, legislation that gives you more of what you want? There's lots of questions here, and the judicial process is our best hope. But that's being eroded by both political parties at present and by really the state of the world. And that's really troubling because the only thing between us and them is the process. That's it. Okay, that ends the final lecture for material that will be on the midterm, and we will pick it up when we're looking at the court cases. In the interim, you should look at the cases that have been laid out, and especially the last two, which is what we're going to really focus on, because those last two really have captured and focused a lot on the rule of law and the like, and the judicial process on two issues, right? Gun control and women's right to choose. So we're going to get there. That's where we really want to spend our time, because those are issues that are really important. Not that other issues aren't, but really important in the present day for us to be able to look at in the future as well. So if you get this, if you get the time, you should start looking at those things and try and apply in your mind as you go through these principles we've talked about in human nature, structure of how the courts are structured, and the rule of law. That ends this lecture.